New York City was trying to drown itself tonight. The rain wasn't just falling. It was being driven into the pavement like nails by a wind that screamed down the avenues, rattling the bones of the old buildings and the teeth of anyone foolish enough to be caught outside. I adjusted my grip on the handle of the umbrella, fighting a losing battle against the gale. The metal frame groaned, threatening to snap and turn inside out, useless against the onslaught. Beside me, Lily shivered violently. She was pressing her small body against my hip, trying to walk in my rhythm, but her little legs were struggling to keep up with my anxious pace. I pulled her closer, wrapping part of my worn wool coat around her shoulders, though it was barely enough to keep me warm, let alone shield both of us from the biting November chill. We should have been home 20 minutes ago. The late shift at the diner had run over because the manager, a man with grease permanently etched into his fingerprints and a soul to match, decided the floor wasn't mopped to his impossible standards. I hadn't argued. I couldn't afford to argue. Every extra dollar was a carton of milk, a loaf of bread, or a box of crayons to keep a traumatized boy silent and occupied while I worked double shifts. "Maria, my socks are wet," Lily murmured, her voice small and miserable, barely audible over the roar of the city storm. "I know, Bug. I'm sorry. We're almost there. Just 2 more blocks," I promised, scanning the street with vigilant eyes. The street was desolate, possessing the kind of emptiness that usually signaled trouble in this neighborhood. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, jumping shadows against the brick facades of the tenements. Most people had the sense to be indoors, hidden away from the storm and the predators that prowled when the sun went down. But we were exposed, 2 small figures moving through the gray wash of the night. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a sensation that had become my constant companion over the last 7 days. Ever since I found him, ever since I brought a ghost into our home. Every siren wail made me jump. Every shadow looked like a monster. Ahead, under the halo of a street lamp that buzzed like an angry hornet, there was a man. He didn't belong here. It wasn't just the way he stood, tall, commanding, taking up space as if he owned the very concrete beneath his feet. It was the silhouette of him. Even through the sheets of rain, the cut of his coat was too sharp, the fabric too heavy and expensive to be worn by anyone who lived in a 5-block radius of my apartment. He wasn't walking with purpose, and he wasn't looking for trouble. He was doing something that made my steps falter, my protective instincts flaring hot and bright. He was wrestling with a thick roll of paper and a staple gun, fighting the wind to affix a flyer to the wooden utility pole. A black SUV, sleek and ominous like a land shark, idled a few yards away. The engine purred with a low, menacing rumble that vibrated in my chest. 2 men in dark trench coats stood by the vehicle, looking miserable and on edge, their eyes scanning the darkness with the practiced paranoia of professional security. They stepped toward the man at the pole, one of them reaching out as if to take the staple gun, to do the menial task for him. The man shoved him away. The motion was violent, abrupt, a command without words. "Leave me alone." It was the gesture of a man who was dangerously close to snapping, a man holding on to his sanity by a thread. "Who is that?" Lily whispered, her curiosity momentarily overriding the cold. "Just keep walking, Lily. Keep your head down," I instructed, my grip on her hand tightening until I feared I might hurt her. My instinct was to cross the street, to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever drama was playing out under that light. Men like that, men who had armored SUVs waiting and subordinates they could shove without consequence, brought nothing but wreckage to people like us. But the sidewalk was narrow, and a construction barrier forced us to stay on his side. There was no escape. I pulled the umbrella lower, trying to create a shield, hoping we could slip past as invisible ghosts. As we drew parallel to him, the wind gusted, a malicious breath of the city. It ripped the flyer from his wet hands. The paper tumbled through the air, dancing erratically before plastering itself against my shin. I froze. The man froze. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the relentless hiss of the rain and the thrum of the idling car. I looked down. The paper was soaked, the ink threatening to run, but the image was clear. It was a high-resolution photo, not a grainy copy. A boy with dark curls and a smile that showed a missing front tooth. Above the photo, in bold, red letters, missing, Matteo Versiani, 5 years old. Substantial reward. No questions asked. The air left my lungs. The world tilted on its axis. I knew that face. I knew the curve of that cheek, the way his eyes crinkled when he was confused. I knew it because I had spent the last 7 days wiping tears from those cheeks. I knew it because that boy was currently curled up on a mattress in my living room, clutching a stuffed bear that used to belong to my father. I reached down to peel the paper off my leg, my fingers trembling uncontrollably. When I straightened up, the man had turned. Roberto Verciani. I didn't know his name then, but I knew his face. It was the kind of face that stopped traffic. Stark, brutal angles softened only by the depth of the agony etched into his features. He was soaked to the bone, his dark hair plastered to his skull, water dripping from his jaw. But it was his eyes that pinned me to the spot. They were dark, endless pits of brown, usually likely sharp and calculating, but now they looked like shattered glass. They were red-rimmed, wild with a lack of sleep and an overdose of despair. He looked like a man who was hollowed out, standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the wind to push him over. He didn't look at me, not really. He looked at the flyer in my hand. He looked ready to snatch it back, to staple it to the pole, to keep doing the only thing he could control in a world that had spun out of his control. I started to hand it to him, my instinct to flee warring with the sudden crushing weight of empathy. He wasn't a monster in that second. He wasn't a rich man, or a dangerous man. He was a father living his worst nightmare. Then Lily tugged on my hand. She stepped out from the shelter of the umbrella, oblivious to the rain that immediately darkened her blonde hair. She pointed a small, pale finger at the soggy piece of paper I was holding, and then she pointed at the man. "He lives in my house," she said. Her voice was clear, cutting through the noise of the storm like a bell. The world stopped. The rain seemed to pause in midair. The idling SUV engine went silent in my ears. The 2 guards by the car straightened, their hands moving inside their coats, reaching for weapons. But Roberto didn't move for a weapon. He turned to stone. He looked down at Lily, blinking as if he couldn't process the English language. His chest heaved, a ragged intake of breath that sounded like a sob trapped in a cage of ribs. He fell to his knees. He didn't lower himself gracefully. He collapsed onto the wet concrete, putting him at eye level with my 6-year-old sister. The expensive fabric of his trousers soaked up the filth of the sidewalk instantly. He didn't care. "What did you say?" His voice was a rasp, a sound of gravel grinding together. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at Lily with an intensity that would have terrified a grown man. But Lily, with the innocence of a child who had seen too much hardship to be easily rattled, just blinked. "The boy," Lily said, pointing at the paper again. "Matteo. He doesn't like thunder. He's in our house." Roberto's head snapped up to look at me. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by a surge of adrenaline so potent I could almost smell it. He stood up, towering over me, the water dripping from his nose, his intensity blazing like a forest fire. "Is this true?" he demanded. He stepped closer, invading my personal space. The scent of him, expensive cologne, rain, and the metallic tang of fear, filled my senses. I gripped the umbrella handle until my knuckles turned white. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was the moment. This was the dangerous edge I had been walking for a week. I had hidden the boy because the police were corrupt, because the system was broken, because I was terrified that if I handed him over to the wrong person, he would vanish forever. But looking at this man, seeing the raw, bleeding, open wound of his grief, I knew I wasn't handing him over to the system. I was handing him to his blood. "Yes," I whispered. The word was barely audible. He grabbed my shoulders. His grip was hard, bruising, but his hands were shaking violently. "Where? Where is he? Is he alive? Is he hurt?" "He's alive," I said quickly, trying to de-escalate the violence brewing in his eyes. "He's safe. He's sleeping. Take me to him." It wasn't a request. It was a primal command. "Sir, we should call for backup," one of the guards shouted, stepping forward, his hand revealing the glint of steel beneath his coat. Roberto didn't even look back. Stay back. If you move, I will kill you myself." The threat was delivered with a cold, flat certainty that made the guard freeze instantly. Roberto looked back at me. "Take me." I nodded, unable to speak. I turned, pulling Lily back under the umbrella, and began to walk. The distance to my building was only half a block, but it felt like miles. I could hear his footsteps behind me. Heavy, urgent, splashing through the puddles. He didn't wait for his guards. He didn't check his surroundings. He was solely focused on my back, on the promise Lily had made. My mind raced. What if he thought I kidnapped him? What if he thought I was holding him for ransom? The flyer said, "No questions asked." But men like him always asked questions, and the answers were usually extracted with pain. But I couldn't run. I couldn't lie. Not with Lily there. Not with the truth waiting on my living room floor. We reached the front door of my building. It was a crumbling brownstone, the paint peeling, the buzzer system broken for years. I fumbled with my keys, my fingers slippery with rain and nerves. The key stuck in the lock. It always did. You had to jiggle it to the left, then push. "Open it!" Roberto growled from behind me. He was so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I'm trying," I snapped, panic making my voice sharp. "It sticks." He reached over, his large hand covering mine. For a second, his skin was warm against my freezing fingers. He didn't shove me aside. He steadied my hand. He turned the key with precise, controlled force. The lock clicked. He pushed the door open and held it, ushering us inside. The lobby smelled of old cooking oil and damp carpet. The fluorescent light overhead flickered with a maddening buzz. "Basement apartment," I said, leading the way down the narrow, scuffed stairs. He followed, his breathing loud in the confined space. Every step he took seemed to echo with the weight of his authority. I was bringing a wolf into our den, but I prayed he wouldn't bite the hand that had fed his cub. I unlocked my apartment door. It was the only lock in the building I had paid to replace with a deadbolt, spending money I didn't have to ensure we were safe at night. I pushed the door open and stepped aside, pressing my back against the frame to let him pass. The apartment was small. One main room that served as a living area and bedroom for the kids, a tiny kitchenette in the corner, and a bathroom the size of a closet. It was poor. The furniture was mismatched, salvaged from curbsides, and the rug was threadbare, but it was clean. It smelled of the tomato soup I had made before leaving for work, which I had left in the slow cooker to keep warm. Roberto stepped over the threshold. He stopped. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at the cracks in the ceiling or the water stains on the walls. His gaze went straight to the corner of the room. There, on a mattress I had pulled onto the floor because he was afraid of falling out of the sofa, lay Mateo. He was curled into a ball, his breathing soft and rhythmic. He was wearing one of Lily's old oversized t-shirts with a faded cartoon cat on it. His thumb was near his mouth, and his other hand was clutching the worn-out velvet ear of Mr. Bear. He looked small, fragile, and completely peaceful. The silence in the room was absolute. It was heavy, thick with the kind of emotion that makes the air hard to breathe. Roberto made a sound that I will never forget. It was a whimper. A high, broken noise that had no business coming from the throat of a man who looked like he could crush a skull with his bare hands. It was the sound of a soul being stitched back together. He moved across the room like a man walking in a dream, terrified that any sudden movement would wake him up and shatter the illusion. He approached the mattress. He didn't touch the boy immediately. He hovered, his hands trembling in the air, tracing the outline of Mateo's body without making contact, as if verifying that he was real, that he was solid. Then, slowly, agonizingly, Roberto sank to the floor. He ignored the dampness of his suit, the hard linoleum. He didn't care about dignity or power. He fell to his knees beside the mattress. He reached out and brushed a lock of hair off Mateo's forehead. His hand, so large it could encompass the boy's entire head, was incredibly gentle. "Mateo," he whispered. "Mateo." The name hung in the air. A prayer answered. He bowed his head, his forehead resting on the edge of the mattress, his shoulders beginning to shake. The man who had terrified the guards outside, the man who commanded respect and fear, was gone. In his place was just a father, who had found the only thing that mattered. The silence that followed Roberto Verciani's breakdown was heavier than the storm raging outside. It was a thick, suffocating blanket that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the tiny basement apartment. For a long time, the only sound was the ragged breathing of a man pulling himself back together, piece by fractured piece. I watched from the doorway, my hand still gripping Lily's shoulder so hard I forced myself to relax my fingers. The tableau before me was something out of a Renaissance painting. The dark, powerful figure bowed over the innocent, bathed in the harsh, flickering light of the single overhead bulb. But paintings were static. This was volatile. This was a bomb that had just been diffused, and I had no idea if the timer had actually stopped or just reset. Roberto moved. The transformation was terrifying to witness. One moment, he was a father shattered by relief, his forehead resting on the dirty mattress, his expensive suit ruined by the grime of my floor. The next, he was rising. It wasn't a clumsy struggle to stand. It was a fluid, predatory ascent. He didn't wipe his face with the back of his hand like a normal person would. He simply inhaled, a long, controlled breath through his nose, and the grief evaporated. In its place, something cold and metallic slammed into existence. The vulnerability was locked away behind a wall of impenetrable steel. He adjusted his cufflinks, a reflexive, almost mechanical gesture, and when he turned to face me, the eyes that met mine weren't the tear-filled eyes of a parent anymore. They were the dry, burning eyes of a man who ruled a kingdom built on violence. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked at me. He looked at the water dripping from the hem of my coat. He looked at the worn-out sneakers on my feet. He looked at the way I had positioned myself slightly in front of Lily, a subconscious shield. He was dissecting me, peeling back layers of intent and history with a single sweep of his gaze. "Lock the door," he said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of the emotion that had cracked it open minutes ago. I hesitated. "The lock is flimsy. If you want to leave..." I said lock it. I turned and threw the deadbolt. My hands were shaking, the metal feeling freezing against my skin. When I turned back, he had moved. He was no longer by the mattress. He was standing in the center of the room, dominating the small space. The ceiling was low, and he seemed to scrape against it, a giant trapped in a dollhouse. "How long?" he asked. "I told you," I managed to say, my voice steady, despite the flutter of terror in my throat. 7 days. 7 days, he repeated. The words were flat, hard stones. 7 days my son has been missing. 7 days I have torn this city apart. I have burned down warehouses. I have broken fingers. I have not slept. I have not eaten. He took a step toward me. And for 7 days, he has been sleeping on a mattress in a basement. He was safe, I said quickly. Safe? He laughed, but it was a dark, mirthless sound that made the hair on my arm stand up. You live in a neighborhood where gunshots are background noise. You have a door that could be kicked in by a teenager. You call this safe? I kept him alive! The anger flared in me, sudden and hot, overriding the fear. I wasn't going to let him stand there and judge the sanctuary I had scraped together. I fed him. I watched him every second I wasn't working. I paid a neighbor I trust to sit with him when I had to leave. I did the best I could. Why didn't you call the police? The question was a whip crack. It was the accusation I had been dreading, the logical question that made me look like a criminal. I couldn't, I said. Couldn't? He stepped closer, invading my personal space. The scent of him, rain, expensive leather, and the sharp tang of ozone was overwhelming. There is a phone on the wall. There are payphones on every corner. You could have walked into a precinct. Unless, his eyes narrowed, dark pits of suspicion. Unless you wanted something. Unless you were waiting for the reward to get higher. No. The denial tore out of my throat. Lily flinched behind me, and I reached back to squeeze her hand. I didn't want your money. I didn't even know who you were until tonight. Then why? He roared the word, his control slipping just enough to show the magma beneath the rock. Why did you keep a 5-year-old boy from his father? I took a deep breath, trying to slow my racing heart. I needed him to hear me. I needed him to understand, not just listen. I found him a week ago. I began, my voice trembling but gaining strength as I spoke. I was taking out the trash behind the hotel. It was freezing, just like tonight. I heard a noise in the dumpster. I thought it was a stray cat. Roberto's jaw tightened. A muscle feathered in his cheek. He was listening, intently, analyzing every syllable for a lie. He was buried under cardboard boxes, I continued, the memory washing over me, the smell of rotting vegetables, the small shivering shape. He was curled up so tight he looked like a ball. He was wearing that suit he has on now, but it was covered in mud. When I tried to touch him, he screamed. No sound came out but his face. It was a scream. I looked over at Mateo, who was watching us from the mattress, his eyes wide and unblinking. He wasn't asleep anymore. He was witnessing his rescue, silent as a ghost. I managed to get him out, I said, turning back to Roberto. I brought him into the kitchen to warm him up. My manager wasn't there. I gave him some hot milk. I was going to call 911. That was the first thing I thought of. Obviously. But if the first police car on the scene belonged to the same people who had put him in that dumpster, then every number I could dial was just another way of leading them back to him. So why didn't you? Roberto demanded. Because a patrol car pulled into the alley, I said. Roberto went still. Absolutely still. They were on a break, I said. 2 officers, uniforms, badges, guns. They got out to smoke. Mateo saw them through the service window. I paused, remembering the terror that had seized the boy. It hadn't been normal fear. It had been a primal, animalistic panic. He went crazy, I whispered. He started clawing at the walls. He was trying to hide under the industrial sink. He was pointing at them and shaking his head. He found his voice for 1 second. Just 1 second. He pointed at the police officer, a man with a mustache, badge number 492. I remember it because I stared at it. And he said, "Bad man." He said, "them." Roberto didn't breathe. He didn't blink. He was a statue carved from ice. He pointed at the police, Roberto said, his voice dangerously quiet. He pointed at the uniform, I corrected. He was terrified of the uniform. He made it very clear that the men in blue were the ones who took him, or the ones who gave him to whoever took him. I took a step closer to Roberto, desperate for him to believe me. If I had called 911, they would have sent a patrol car. Maybe those same men, maybe their friends. I couldn't take that risk. I looked at that little boy, shaking on the floor, and I knew that if I put him in the system, he would disappear, this time for good. The silence stretched, taut as a wire. Roberto looked at me, searching for deception. He looked for the telltale signs of a lie. The shifting eyes, the fidgeting hands. But I had nothing to hide. I had spent a week terrified that I was making the wrong choice. But looking at his face now, I knew I hadn't. Badge number 492. Roberto repeated softly. Yes, I said. Officer, distinct scar on his chin. Roberto closed his eyes for a brief second. When he opened them, the suspicion was gone, replaced by a cold, deadly realization, a fury that wasn't directed at me, but at something invisible to my eyes. Detective Miller, he murmured. He was on my payroll. He was at my house for Christmas last year. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. The betrayal, the rot inside his own fortress. You didn't call the police, Roberto said, his voice sounding distant, because the police were the ones who sold him. I didn't know that for sure, I admitted, but I couldn't gamble with his life, so I brought him here. It was the only place nobody would look. Who looks for a billionaire's son in a basement apartment on 4th Street? Roberto looked around the room again. This time, he didn't look with judgment. He looked with clarity. He saw the blockade I had built at the door each night, a heavy wooden chair wedged under the handle. He saw the coloring books I had bought from the dollar store. He saw the slow cooker bubbling in the corner. He walked over to the kitchen counter. He picked up a box of cereal. It was a generic brand, the cheapest one available. He looked at the price sticker still on the top. Then he looked at the empty shelves. He realized that I had fed his son before I fed myself. He realized that the circles under my eyes were there because I had stayed awake watching the door while his son slept. He turned back to me. The menace had receded, leaving behind a profound, unsettling intensity. You have nothing, he stated. It wasn't an insult. It was an observation. I have enough, I countered defensively. No, he shook his head. You have nothing. And yet, you gave him everything you had. He walked toward me again, stopping just inches away. He looked down at me, his dark eyes scanning my face as if memorizing my features for a file. Do you know who I am, Maria? I know you're his father, I said. And I know you're dangerous. I am Roberto Verziani, he said. The name carried weight, heavy and dark. I run this city. Or I thought I did. Until tonight I thought I saw everything. But I didn't see the snakes in my own garden. He reached out. For a second, I thought he was going to strike me. I flinched, but his hand bypassed me and landed on Lily's head. He smoothed her wet hair, a gesture strangely tender for a man discussing betrayal and murder. You saved my life, he said. Not just his, mine, because if I had lost him, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The abyss that opened up in his eyes said enough. He pulled his hand back and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a sleek black smartphone. He didn't dial a number. He pressed a single button on the side. It's me, he said into the device. His voice was commanding, absolute. I have him. A pause. Someone on the other end was shouting, likely asking questions. Silence, Roberto ordered. I said I have him. He is unharmed. Listen to me very carefully, Marco. Do not use the main frequency. Our communications are compromised. Miller is a traitor. Anyone associated with the 9th Precinct is suspect. I watched him, fascinated and terrified. He was flipping a switch, turning from a grieving father into a warlord. Bring the extraction team, he continued. But do not bring them to the main entrance. Park on the parallel street. Come through the alley. I want a ghost extraction. No sirens, no lights. He paused again, listening. Then he looked at me. Address? He asked. 412 Oak Street, apartment 1B, I whispered. 412 Oak Street. He repeated into the phone. We are burning this location. My head snapped up. What? Roberto ignored me. 5 minutes, Marco. If you are late, don't bother coming at all. He hung up the phone and slipped it back into his pocket. The air in the room had shifted again. It was no longer a confession booth. It was a staging ground. What do you mean, burning this location? I asked, panic rising in my chest. This is my home. Not anymore, Roberto said. He walked over to the window, peering through the cracks in the blinds, checking the street level. You think Miller acted alone? You think a detective snatches a Mafia Don's son without backing? The O'Sullivans are behind this. And if Miller knows where to look, if anyone saw you, he turned to face me. They will come here. They will come to tie up loose ends. You are a loose end, Maria. I can just leave for a few days, I stammered. I can go to a motel. A motel? He looked at me as if I were a child proposing to fight a tank with a stick. If they find you, they won't just kill you. They will torture you to find out what you told me. They will use you to get to me again. And they will go through her to do it. He pointed at Lily. The blood drained from my face. I looked at my sister. She was watching Roberto with wide, trusting eyes, completely unaware that he had just outlined her potential demise. So what happens? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. You come with me, Roberto said. It wasn't an offer. It wasn't a question. It was a decree. I can't just go with you, I argued, though the fight was leaving me. I have a job. I have bills. I have a life here. You have a job scrubbing toilets and washing dishes, he said brutally. You have bills you can't pay, and your life here ended the moment you picked up my son from that dumpster. He walked over to me, grabbing my upper arms. His grip was firm, grounding. He forced me to look at him. You protected what is mine, he said, intense, dark eyes boring into my soul. Now, I protect what is yours. That is the law. My law. I don't know your laws, I whispered. You will learn them, he said. Pack a bag. Essentials only. You have 3 minutes. I stared at him. I wanted to tell him to go to hell. I wanted to tell him to get out of my apartment and take his danger with him. But then I looked at Mateo. He had crawled off the mattress and was standing next to Roberto's leg, clutching the fabric of his trousers. He looked at me, and then he looked at Lily. He reached out and took Lily's hand. The two children stood there, hand in hand, united by the strange, silent bond of childhood. If I stayed here, I was dead. Roberto was right. I knew enough about the way the world worked to know that witnesses to this kind of power struggle didn't retire to Florida. They disappeared into the Hudson River. 3 minutes, I said, pulling away from his grip. I grabbed the duffel bag from under the bed, the one I kept ready for emergencies, though usually the emergency was a landlord eviction, not a mob war. I moved with frantic haste. I threw in Lily's favorite sweater, the one with the hole in the elbow. I grabbed my toothbrush. I grabbed the small wooden box that held my mother's necklace and my birth certificate. Roberto stood by the door, his gun drawn now. He wasn't looking at us. He was watching the hallway, his body angled to shield the room. He was a sentinel, a monster, standing guard over his treasure. "Maria?" Lily asked, her voice trembling slightly as she saw me frantically stuffing clothes into the bag. "Are we going on a trip?" I paused, holding a pair of socks in my hand. I looked at the damp walls of the apartment that had been our prison and our sanctuary. I looked at the man who had brought the storm inside. "Yes, Bug," I said, forcing a smile onto my face. "We're going on a trip." "Where?" I looked at Roberto. He turned his head slightly, catching my gaze. There was no softness in his face, but there was something else. A promise. A vow written in blood and rain. "Somewhere safe," I said. "Time is up," Roberto announced. He holstered his weapon but kept his hand near it. He scooped Mateo up in one arm, the boy settling against his hip as if he belonged there. With his other hand, he reached out and opened the door. "Stay behind me," he ordered. "Do not stop walking. If I say down, you drop to the floor. Do you understand?" "I understand," I said, hoisting the bag onto my shoulder and grabbing Lily's hand. We stepped out into the hallway. It smelled of cabbage and stale smoke, same as always. But it felt different now. It felt like a tunnel leading to another world. I was walking away from the only life I knew, stepping into the dark shadow of a man I shouldn't trust, but who was currently the only barrier between us and death. As we reached the stairs, Roberto paused. He looked back at me one last time. "You did good, Maria," he said. The words were quiet, almost lost in the creak of the floorboards. It was the first time anyone had told me that in years. "Let's go," he said, and we walked up the stairs, leaving the basement behind, heading toward the waiting night. The rain had stopped, but the storm was just beginning. The ride to the safe house was a blur of motion and silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic swish of windshield wipers against bulletproof glass. I sat in the back of the massive black SUV, squeezed between Lily and the door, while Roberto sat opposite us, Mateo asleep against his chest. The interior smelled of new leather and the sharp metallic scent of the rain that clung to our clothes. We didn't go to the Vertiani estate. I knew enough from the tabloids and the whispers in the city that the family compound was in Long Island, a fortress of old money and older secrets. Instead, the convoy of 3 cars cut through the slick streets of Manhattan, heading toward the skyline that pierced the low-hanging clouds. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the pressurized cabin. Roberto didn't open his eyes. His hand was resting protectively over Mateo's ear, shielding him from the hum of the road. A ghost location. Not on any deed, not in any database. If we want to stay alive tonight, we need to be invisible. Invisible. I had spent my whole life being invisible. The maid who cleaned the room while the guests ignored her. The waitress who refilled the coffee, while the businessmen argued. But this was a different kind of invisibility. This was erasure. The cars pulled into the underground garage of a glass needle of a building in Tribeca. Security was tight, brutal, and efficient. Men with earpieces and assault rifles that looked terrifyingly modern swarmed the vehicle before the doors even unlocked. Roberto stepped out first, shielding Mateo with his body, his eyes scanning the concrete shadows with predatory intensity. "Move," he ordered, extending a hand to help Lily out. We were ushered into a private elevator that had no buttons, only a biometric scanner. Roberto pressed his palm against the panel. A green light scanned his retina. The doors hissed shut, sealing us in a steel box that shot upward with stomach-churning speed. When the doors opened, we weren't in a home. We were in a fortress in the sky. The penthouse was vast, spanning the entire top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the drowning city. But there was no warmth here. The furniture was sleek, Italian, and uncomfortable-looking. The surfaces were polished marble and chrome. It looked like a showroom, or a high-end medical facility, devoid of personal touches. No photos, no clutter, no life. "Check the perimeter," Roberto barked at Marco, the head of his security detail, a man with a neck as thick as a tree trunk. "I want the blast shields engaged on the windows. Nothing comes in, nothing goes out." "Yes, boss." I held Lily's hand tight as metal shutters began to descend over the magnificent view, turning the penthouse into a luxury bunker. The sound of the locks engaging, heavy, industrial thuds, echoed in the large space. "Put the boy in the master suite," Roberto instructed a younger guard. But then he stopped himself. He looked down at Matteo, who was beginning to stir, his eyes fluttering open in panic as he realized he was in a strange place. Matteo let out a silent cry, his small hands grasping at the air. "I'll take him," I said, stepping forward before I could think about the hierarchy in the room. Roberto looked at me. For a second, I thought he would snap at me for interrupting. But he saw the way Matteo was reaching for me. Not for his father, but for the woman who had fed him soup for a week. A flash of pain crossed Roberto's face, raw and unguarded, before he masked it. "Go," he said. "Second door on the right." I led the children into the bedroom. It was bigger than my entire apartment. The bed was a king-sized expanse of white linens that probably cost more than my father's truck. I sat Matteo down in the center of it. He immediately curled up into a ball, pulling his knees to his chest. Lily climbed up beside him, patting his arm. "It's okay, Leo," she whispered, using the name we had called him. "It's like a spaceship." I spent the next hour trying to turn the sterile room into something resembling a sanctuary. I found extra pillows in the closet and built a fort, just like we did in the basement. I closed the heavy curtains to hide the blast shields. I kept the lights low. But the real problem started when the food arrived. Roberto entered the room an hour later, followed by a man pushing a cart laden with silver platters. The smell of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the air, rich and mouth-watering. My stomach rumbled audibly. I hadn't eaten since lunch, but I ignored it. "Dinner," Roberto announced. He had changed out of his wetsuit into a black t-shirt and dark jeans. Without the armor of the tailored jacket, he looked even more dangerous. The muscles in his arms shifted as he crossed them over his chest. "He needs to eat." The staff member placed a plate of perfectly cut chicken and steamed vegetables in front of Matteo. Matteo looked at the food. Then he looked at the man who brought it. Then he looked at Roberto. He pushed the plate away, shaking his head violently. He squeezed his eyes shut and clamped his mouth closed. "Matteo, eat," Roberto said, his voice gentle but firm. "It is from Nonna's recipe. You love this." It was his grandmother's recipe, nonna, a word that wrapped the food in something almost sacred. Matteo refused. He was trembling. "He won't eat it," I said quietly from the edge of the bed where I was sitting with Lily. Roberto turned to me, his patience fraying. "He is starving. He has to eat. He thinks it's poisoned," I explained. "The men who took him, they must have given him something, or threatened him with food. For the first 2 days at my place, he wouldn't touch anything unless I took a bite first, and swallowed it in front of him." Roberto's face darkened, a storm cloud passing over his features as he imagined what his son had endured. He looked at the plate, then at his son, helpless in the face of the trauma. I stood up. I walked over to the cart and picked up a fork. I didn't ask for permission. I speared a piece of chicken and a carrot. I knelt down in front of Matteo, making sure I was at his eye level. "Look, Matteo," I said softly. I put the food in my mouth. I chewed slowly, exaggerating the motion. I swallowed. I opened my mouth to show him it was gone. I smiled. "See? Good. Safe." I waited 5 seconds. 10. Matteo watched me with intense focus. He watched my throat. He watched my eyes to see if I would fall over. When I remained upright and smiling, his shoulders dropped about an inch. He reached out a hesitant hand. I handed him the fork. He took it and took a tiny bite. Then another. Soon he was eating with the ravenous hunger of a growing boy. I felt a gaze burning into the side of my face. I turned to find Roberto watching me. He wasn't looking at the food. He was looking at me with an expression that was a terrifying mixture of awe and calculation. He was realizing that I held the key to his son's recovery, a key he didn't possess. "You have done this before," he said quietly, stepping closer as Matteo focused on his meal. "Done what?" "Handled fear. You don't flinch when I raise my voice. You don't shake when you see guns. You knew to block the door of your apartment with a chair wedged under the handle, not just leaning against it. That is a tactical barricade, not a civilian guess." I stood up, wiping my hands on my jeans. The adrenaline of the escape was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. But his scrutiny kept me sharp. "My father," I said simply. "He lived in Ohio. He wanted a son. He got me, and then, years later, Lily. He didn't believe in dolls. He believed in preparation." Roberto raised an eyebrow. "Preparation for what?" "For everything. Economic collapse, home invasion, the end of the world." I shrugged, a bitter smile touching my lips. He was paranoid. I grew up thinking the sky was falling. He taught me to shoot a rifle when I was 8. He taught me how to check for exits when I walk into a room. He taught me that if you can't be strong, you have to be smart. And where is he now? He died 3 years ago. "Heart attack," I said. "He spent his whole life preparing for a war that never came, and his own heart killed him while he was watching TV. But," I looked at Matteo, who was now sharing a piece of chicken with Lily. I guess the lessons stuck. "When I saw that cop in the alley, I didn't see a uniform. I saw a predator. My dad taught me to spot predators." Roberto stared at me for a long moment. The silence between us stretched, thick with unsaid words. He stepped closer, invading my personal space again. But this time it felt less like intimidation and more like magnetism. "You spotted a predator," he murmured, his voice low. "And you saved my bloodline because of it." His phone buzzed in his pocket, shattering the moment. He pulled it out, his eyes never leaving my face as he answered. "Speak." He listened for a moment, his jaw tightening. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Confirmed?" he asked. A pause. "Good. Deal with it." "No, not quickly. Make it last." He hung up and looked at me. "You were right." "About what?" "Detective Miller. Badge 492. Roberto walked over to the window, staring at the metal shutters as if he could see through them to the city below. My men swept his financials. He received a deposit into an offshore account 3 days before Matteo was taken. A deposit from a shell company linked to the O'Sullivan family. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I knew it. I knew he looked wrong. "You have excellent instincts, Maria Foster," Roberto said, turning back to face me. "Better than half the men on my payroll." He walked over to the wet bar in the corner of the room and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. He held one out to me. "I don't drink," I said automatically. "It's for the nerves. Drink," he ordered, but the edge was gone from his voice. I took the glass. The crystal was heavy, cold in my hand. I took a small sip. The whiskey burned on the way down, a fire that matched the one in his eyes. "So, what happens now?" I asked, looking at the children. Lily had fallen asleep next to Matteo, her head on his shoulder. "You have your son. You know who the traitor is. The O'Sullivans. They'll know you have him back soon. They already know," Roberto said grimly. "The moment I extracted you, the clock started ticking. War is coming, Maria. A war that will make the storm outside look like a gentle breeze." "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "So give us some money, enough to get a bus ticket to somewhere far away, Idaho or Montana. Nobody will look for us there. We'll disappear. You'll never see us again." Roberto swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching the amber vortex. "Is that what you want? To disappear?" "I want my sister to be safe," I said fiercely. "That's all I want. And you think you can keep her safe?" He looked at me, his gaze piercing. You have no money. You have no resources. And now, you have a connection to the Versiani family. The O'Sullivans are not the kind of men who forgive. They will assume you know things. They will assume you saw faces. They will hunt you down, Maria. Not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But one day, you will be walking Lily to school, and a van will pull up, and you will never be seen again. The horror of his words washed over me. I felt bile rise in my throat. You're trying to scare me. I am trying to save you, he countered. Again, he set his glass down on the marble table with a sharp click. You cannot leave. Not yet. I'm not your prisoner, I said, though I felt like one, a prisoner in a gilded cage. No, you are my guest, he said. But look at him. He pointed to the bed. Matteo was asleep now, but his hand was reaching out, clutching the hem of Lily's sweater. He trusts you, Roberto said, his voice dropping to a whisper that sounded like a confession. He won't eat for me. He won't speak to me. He looks at me, and he sees the man who failed to protect him. But he looks at you, and he sees safety. He walked over to me, stopping so close that I could feel the heat radiating from his chest. I had to tilt my head back to look him in the eyes. I can buy armies, Maria, he said. I can buy politicians. I can buy silence. But I cannot buy trust. And I certainly cannot buy the way that boy looks at you. I'm a chambermaid, I whispered. I'm nobody. You are the woman who brought my son back from the dead. He corrected. You are not nobody. Not anymore. He reached out and for the first time touched me. His fingers grazed my chin, tilting my face up toward the light. His skin was rough, calloused, the hands of a man who did his own dirty work. The touch sent a shockwave through my nervous system, a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the man standing in front of me. You stay, he said. You stay here, under my protection. You watch over him while I deal with the O'Sullivans. You ensure he eats. You ensure he sleeps. And in return, I breathed. In return, I give you the world, he said. I will set up a trust for your sister. She will go to the best schools. She will never know hunger or cold again. You will never scrub another toilet. You will be comfortable. I don't want comfort, I said, pulling away from his touch, though my skin burned where his fingers had been. I want freedom. Freedom is an illusion, Roberto said darkly. Safety is the only reality that matters. And right now, the only safety you have is inside these walls. He stepped back, the distance between us suddenly feeling vast. The guest room is down the hall for you and the girl, he said, his businesslike demeanor returning. But tonight, stay with him. If he wakes up and you are gone, he will panic. I wasn't planning on leaving him, I said. Good. He walked toward the door. He paused with his hand on the biometric scanner. He didn't look back. Get some sleep, Maria. You look like you've been fighting a war. Maybe I have, I murmured. Then rest, he said. Because the next battle starts at sunrise. The door hissed shut behind him, locking with that heavy final thud. I let out a shuddering breath and sank onto the edge of the massive bed. I looked at the 3 sleeping children, Matteo, Lily, and the ghost of the girl I used to be before tonight. I picked up the glass of whiskey he had left. I took another sip. It tasted like smoke and power. I was trapped. I knew it. He had woven a web of logic and fear that I couldn't cut through. But as I looked at Matteo's peaceful face, I realized that even if the doors were unlocked, I couldn't walk out. My father had taught me to survive, but he hadn't taught me how to walk away from a child who needed me. I kicked off my wet sneakers and curled up at the foot of the bed, positioning myself between the children and the door. My hand drifted under the pillow, fingers curling around the cold, hard shape of the heavy brass lamp I had unscrewed from the nightstand while Roberto was talking. It wasn't a gun, but it was a weapon. Roberto Verciani might think I was just a guest, or a nanny, or a loose end, but he was wrong. I was the daughter of a paranoid hunter from Ohio, and if anyone, O'Sullivan or Verciani, tried to hurt these kids, they would find out that I didn't need a fortress to be dangerous. I closed my eyes, listening to the wind howl against the blast shields, and waited for the dawn. The morning sun tried to pierce through the heavy blast shields covering the penthouse windows, but it only managed to cast a dull gray light across the expanse of the main room. The fortress in the sky was silent, save for the hum of the air filtration system and the low murmur of men strategizing in the corner. I sat on the edge of the massive white sofa, holding a cup of coffee that was growing cold in my hands. My eyes were gritty with lack of sleep. I hadn't really slept. I had just hovered in a state of hyper-aware exhaustion, listening for the sound of a door opening or a footstep that didn't belong. In the bedroom, Matteo and Lily were watching cartoons on a television screen the size of a movie theater. They were safe for now, insulated by soundproof walls and Roberto's promise. But out here, in the cold marble reality of the war room, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Roberto stood by the wet bar, which had been converted into a command center. Maps of the city were spread out over the granite counter, weighed down by clips of ammunition and heavy crystal tumblers. He was on the phone again, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He looked different in the daylight. Last night, he had been a force of nature, a creature of rain and violence. Today, he was a CEO of death. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle, and a watch that probably cost more than the building I used to live in. His dark brown eyes, intense, calculating, devoid of the tears I had seen yesterday, scanned a document one of his guards had handed him. "No," Roberto said into the phone, his tone cutting. "I don't care about the optics. I care about the leak. Find it. Plug it. Or I will bury everyone involved." He hung up and rubbed his face with one hand. The exhaustion was there, buried deep beneath the layer of iron will, but he wore it like armor. He looked up and caught me watching him. The mask didn't slip, but his gaze softened just a fraction. He walked over to me, ignoring the two guards, Marco and a new one named Lucas, who were pretending not to listen. "Did they eat?" he asked. "Matteo ate 2 bowls of cereal," I reported. "Lily is trying to teach him sign language for more sugar." A ghost of a smile touched Roberto's lips before vanishing. "Good. You are good with him, Maria. Better than the expensive therapists I hired last year." "I'm not a therapist," I said, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "I'm just someone who knows what it's like to be scared of the people who are supposed to protect you." Roberto's expression tightened. He reached out, his hand hovering near my shoulder before dropping to his side. "I received intelligence an hour ago. We know where the leak came from, and we know where the payment was authorized." "The O'Sullivans?" "The O'Sullivans are the bank," he corrected. "But the broker, the man who arranged the kidnapping, the man who bridged the gap between my organization and their money, is someone else, a middleman. And he is going to be in public tonight. So you go get him," I said. It sounded simple in my head. He was the wolf. He should just go hunt. "It is not that simple," Roberto sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "It is the Children's Hospital Charity Gala. The mayor will be there. The police commissioner, the one who isn't dirty, supposedly, will be there. The press will be swarming. I cannot just walk in and put a bullet in his head. I need to confirm his identity, intercept him, and extract him without causing a panic that brings the National Guard down on my neck." "Okay," I said slowly. "So you go to the party. You smile. You shake hands. You grab the bad guy." "I am going." He nodded. Then he looked at me, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach flip. "And you are coming with me." I almost choked on my coffee. "Excuse me? You are coming with me," he repeated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Absolutely not." I stood up, setting the cup down with a clatter. "I am not going to some fancy gala. I don't belong there. I don't have a dress. I don't know which fork to use. And most importantly, I am not leaving those children. The children will be locked in the panic room," Roberto said calmly. "It is a vault behind the master bedroom closet. It has its own air supply, reinforced steel walls, and a biometric lock that only I can open. Marco will stand guard outside it. It is the safest place on Earth. Then I'll stay in the panic room with them." I countered, crossing my arms. Roberto stepped closer, invading my personal space until all I could see were his dark eyes. No, you cannot stay here. Why? You said it's a fortress. It is, he admitted. But I still do not know who the traitor is inside my own house. Marco is loyal. I would bet my life on it. But the others? The night shift? The perimeter team? He shook his head. If I leave you here, and the leak comes from the security detail, you are a sitting duck. They know you are the witness. They know you can identify the corrupt cop. If they can't get to Matteo in the vault, they will take you. They will use you to force me to open the door. The blood drained from my face. Oh, I cannot focus on the mission if I am wondering if my own guards are selling you out, Roberto said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. I need you where I can see you. I need you in my line of sight. So I'm a liability, I said bitterly. No, he said sharply. You are a strategic asset. Rumors are already spreading that I am weak, that I am grieving, that my son is gone. If I walk into that gala alone, looking like a man hunting for ghosts, I look desperate. But if I walk in with a beautiful woman on my arm, if I look like a man who has everything under control, it confuses them. It makes the traitor nervous. It forces him to make a mistake. I'm not a beautiful woman, I argued, gesturing to my stained jeans and the oversized t-shirt I had borrowed from his closet. I'm a chambermaid, Roberto. I clean up after the people who go to these parties. I don't join them. Roberto looked me up and down. The gaze wasn't leering. It was assessing, like a sculptor looking at a block of marble, knowing exactly what was hidden inside. You are not a maid, he said softly. You are the woman who stared down a wolf and didn't blink. And tonight, you are going to be the Queen of New York. He turned to Marco. Bring the package. Marco nodded and disappeared into the hallway, returning a moment later with a long black garment bag and a sleek shoebox. He hung the bag on the door of the coat closet. I had a stylist pull options based on your measurements, Roberto said, clearing his throat slightly. This one is the best tactical choice. Dark, elegant, not easily forgotten. Tactical choice? I raised an eyebrow. It's a dress, not a Kevlar vest. In my world, Maria, appearance is the strongest armor you can wear. He checked his watch. You have 2 hours. A hair and makeup team is waiting in the guest bath. They have signed NDAs that would cost them their lives if they speak. Use them. And if I say no? Roberto stepped in close again. He didn't touch me, but the air between us crackled with electricity. You won't. Because you know I am right. You know that the safest place for you right now is not behind a locked door, but standing next to the monster who holds the key. He was arrogant. He was infuriating. And he was right. I snatched the garment bag. 2 hours. But if I trip in high heels and embarrass you in front of the mayor, that's on you. A smirk played on his lips. A dangerous, devastating thing. I will catch you. 2 hours later, I didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. The team Roberto had hired were magicians. They had taken my limp, dishwater blonde hair and blown it out into sleek, honey gold waves that cascaded down my back like liquid silk. They had covered the dark circles under my eyes, highlighted my cheekbones, and painted my lips a deep, bruised berry color. But it was the dress that transformed me. It was silk, the color of a deep, rich burgundy wine. Bordeaux, the stylist had called it. It had long sleeves, which I was grateful for, but the back was completely open, plunging down to the base of my spine. It fit like a second skin, hugging every curve I usually tried to hide under baggy uniforms. It was modest in the front, high-necked and severe, but the way the silk moved against my body made me feel naked and armored all at once. I stepped into the black stilettos, taking a moment to find my balance. I was used to rubber-soled sneakers, to rushing across slick kitchen tiles. These shoes forced me to move slower, with more intention. I walked out into the main room. The sun had set, and the penthouse was bathed in the artificial glow of the city lights filtering through the now open blast shields. Roberto was standing by the window, adjusting the cuffs of his tuxedo. He looked like James Bond's darker, deadlier brother. The tuxedo was midnight blue, almost black, tailored to perfection. He heard my heels clicking on the marble floor. He turned. He stopped, his hand stilled on his cuffs. He didn't say anything. He just looked. His eyes started at my feet and traveled up, slowly, lingering on the sway of the silk, the curve of my waist, the exposed skin of my back, as I turned slightly to check for Lily. When his gaze finally met mine, there was a fire in them that had nothing to do with anger. It was raw, masculine appreciation. It was a look of possession. "Maria," he breathed. The name sounded different when he said it like that. Like a prayer. "It fits," I said, feeling suddenly shy, smoothing the fabric over my hips. "It is." He shook his head, seeming to struggle for the English word. "Devastating." "You look dangerous." "Good," I said, lifting my chin. "I feel dangerous." He walked over to me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a velvet box. He flipped it open. Inside sat a diamond necklace, a simple solitaire on a delicate platinum chain. "Turn around," he ordered softly. I turned, exposing my back to him. I felt the heat of his body behind me. I felt his fingers brush the nape of my neck as he lifted my hair. The metal of the chain was cool against my skin, but his fingertips were scorching hot. He took his time fastening the clasp. His breath ghosted over my shoulder, sending shivers racing down my spine. "This is a tracker," he whispered into my ear. "It has a GPS chip embedded in the setting. If we get separated, if anyone takes you, I will find you. Anywhere on this planet." The romance of the moment shattered, replaced by the cold reality of our situation. But strangely, I found it comforting. It wasn't jewelry. It was a leash. And right now, I wanted to be tethered to the biggest dog in the fight. "Understood," I whispered back. He turned me around to face him. His hands settled on my waist. The fabric of the dress was thin. I could feel the heat of his palms burning through it. "We are going into a tank of sharks," he told me, his face serious. "Do not speak to the press. Do not accept drinks from anyone but me. Stay on my left side. My gun is on my right. I need that arm free. If I squeeze your waist twice, you move. Immediately. I know how to be invisible, Roberto," I reminded him. "I've served these people champagne while they talked about their affairs and their crimes. They don't look at the help. They won't look at me." Roberto let out a short, dry laugh. He leaned in, his lips brushing my ear. "You are not the help tonight, Maria. Look in the mirror. No one is going to be able to look away from you. Especially not me." He stepped back, offering me his arm. "Ready?" I took a deep breath, thinking of Matteo safe in the vault, thinking of the badge number 492, thinking of the life I was leaving behind. "Ready," I said. The charity gala was held at the Pierre Hotel. The ballroom was a sea of black ties, glittering jewels, and fake smiles. The air smelled of expensive perfume, lilies, and ambition. A string quartet was playing something classical and soothing in the corner, trying to mask the predatory nature of the gathering. As we walked in, the room didn't go silent. That only happened in movies. But the energy shifted. Heads turned. Whispers started behind gloved hands. Roberto Verciani had arrived, 3 days after rumors of his son's kidnapping had started to circulate in the underworld, and he wasn't grieving. He was standing tall, looking lethal, with a mystery woman in blood-red silk on his arm. I felt the weight of hundreds of eyes. My instinct was to shrink, to grab a tray and start clearing glasses, to blend into the wallpaper. But Roberto's arm was a steel band under mine. He held me close, his body shielding me from the worst of the glare. "Head up," he murmured. "You belong here because I say you belong here." We moved through the crowd,